Okay, this is going to be a very different video from the kind I normally make. I don't have a script for this, so it might get a little bit more rambly, and I'm going to say a lot more, but I just kind of wanted to throw this together for the sake that I'm kind of riding the high of the Nintendo's E3 conference, and I'm a huge Zelda fan, and I have a lot of strong opinions about Breath of the Wild, so I want to kind of formulate those combined with my reaction to the trailer for like just 5 things that I want from the Breath of the Wild sequel. That's kind of like, I know that's kind of the most generic YouTube video anyone could ever make, but it's what I feel, so it's what I'm making. So the first thing, the first point I have on this list, I did write out the points, is Get Weird, which is kind of the main thing that I'm excited about. I did see a lot of people, well, maybe not a lot of people, but I saw a few people react to this trailer with kind of an attitude of, alright, yeah, it's another big Zelda game. Why is anyone really surprised this is happening? Like, how is this, like, big news kind of attitude of, like, everyone knew there was going to be another Zelda game, and alright, cool. However, there is a slight difference here, which is that the direct sequels to Zelda games generally have kind of a different feel to them. And it's been a while since we've had one. They're kind of usually a bit weirder, maybe a bit darker or more melancholic, or just in terms of gameplay, have a unique twist on the foundation of the first game that it's following up. The main example, of course, would be Majora's Mask. That's kind of the one that everyone's going to go to, which is that took the foundation of Ocarina of Time and turned it into something completely different, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of story and tone. That is kind of the model example of a direct sequel. But there's a bunch of other examples too. Adventure of Link as a direct sequel to the first Zelda game is completely different. You know, Link's Awakening is a very unique entry, so unique that like this remake it's getting, people are saying, hey, it's unlike any Zelda game you've played, so, although, you know, maybe I wouldn't go that far with it personally, it is very similar to a lot of the other 2D ones, but it has its own unique flavor to it. And even, like, Phantom Hourglass to the Wind Waker is, you know, obviously scaled down for a DS game, but they did something unique with the ocean setting. And then that's kind of like the last direct sequel we really got that I can think of. You know, Twilight Princess did not have one. Skyward Sword did not have one. You know, Spirit Tracks, you can argue it's like a kind of another follow-up to Wind Waker, but it has its own thing. It also, you know, the train thing never got played on again. Even A Link Between Worlds as another sequel to A Link to the Past, it's also kind of its own thing, and it doesn't really get weird in the way a direct sequel does that directly follows it. That's kind of like a very different, like that kind of throwback sequel is very different. But with this one, I think that playing directly off of Breath of the Wild gives it a chance to be weird in a way that Zelda hasn't been for a little bit. And just looking at the little teaser, I mean, I know it's really early footage. Nothing that we see here is probably even going to be in the final game if, you know, past early teasers are any indication. But just looking at the general tone they're going for and a couple of the shots, if these do play into the story of the game, you can kind of see that they're going in a little bit of a different direction. You know, Link has the weird blue glowing hand, there's a lot darker imagery, and there's this underground theme, and I mean, it's super silly to speculate on just a cutscene from an early teaser, but I'm not the only one that when watching kind of like the idea of them throwing supplies on this creature and stopping to get water, that maybe there'll be a bit more of a survival aspect to this, maybe kind of like, and again, now this is just wild speculation, but taking the ideas of Breath of the Wild, which was like crafting and resource management, and change that into like maybe something like a dungeon crawler, or like, you know, just the idea of like, hey, now all of a sudden these resources matter a lot more because we're going into this dangerous place, we gotta stock up on what we can. You know, you could take that in so many ways, you know. Now, again, wild speculation here, but towards the end of the trailer, when Hyrule Castle starts rising up, I know a lot of people said that they thought like, oh, it's gonna just lift up entirely and fly off to the new location that the game is gonna be set in. And there is like one shot of like a dungeon entrance, cave entrance thing that like I don't remember seeing anything like that in Hyrule from Breath of the Wild, so maybe that is a new location. But my mind personally went to something like the Tower of the Gods, where that rose up out of the ocean. I could actually see like Hyrule Castle raising up, and there's like a tower underneath it, or like some kind of massive central dungeon, and then like scavenging resources from the open world around Hyrule Castle, and then using those to journey into a big central dungeon. You know, I don't know if I'd actually want them to do that, but just that's the kind of like I want them to take I want them to take the source of Breath of the Wild, that kind of general outline of its gameplay, and I want them to use it to create something new and weird. And I think that's what direct sequels of Zelda games generally are good at. Whereas if we had just waited another couple of years and then we just got like, okay, now here's another main Zelda game where it's like Hyrule from the Golden Age again, and it's like a big kingdom and it's another big fantasy thing. I think that would have been, you know, a little bit more redundant. So I think, again, get weird. And that's point one. And that's probably the longest point that I have on this list, so this is going to get a lot faster. Okay, so these next two bits are less reactions to the teaser trailer and more just things that I wanted to be improved from Breath of the Wild moving forward. So the first one is the dungeons. Now, I know this is a big talking point. I'm not the first one to mention this by far. But I do want to concede one thing, which is that when they were making Breath of the Wild, one of their main goals was to throw out things they were keeping for tradition's sake. And I feel like it would be kind of way too easy for me as a Zelda fan to say, I want them to add more classic Zelda elements back in. Because, yes, that is what I personally want. But if that's not what they want to do with Breath of the Wild sequel, that is fine. If the Zelda series moving forward wants to continue to try new things, as opposed to just, you know, bringing back the Fire Temple and Forest Temple, that's cool. So in regards to the dungeons, I'm not asking for the traditional dungeons to come back. I am just asking for what is there to be better. I think that the dungeons in Breath of the Wild were cool, but man, there was like only really one that I thought was really good, which was the Gerudo one. I thought the others were kind of just lamer versions of that. And just like aesthetically and puzzle-wise, I feel like the first two that you do are going to feel really fresh, and the last two that you do are going to feel really kind of played out and boring. Obviously, not everyone feels that way, but most people I've talked to feel that, like, no matter what order you do those dungeons in, you're gonna find the last two to be kind of disappointing, because it's really all the same thing. So, I'm cool with them doing something new and different with the dungeons, you know. Like I said, maybe they just do one big dungeon, or maybe they don't do dungeons at all. I'm cool, I'm open for anything. But if we're gonna have dungeons, or any kind of, like, the shrines returning, or anything like that, more variety. Variety in terms of the aesthetics, and variety in terms of what you're doing inside of them. Like if there's gonna be puzzles, I don't want them to be tied to, like, the same four mechanics that, like, every single puzzle in Breath of the Wild was. And the third point, which is, I think, probably the one thing on this list that I am absolutely positive we're getting, is more enemy variety. Now, I know a lot of people do point out that a lot of the enemy selection for Breath of the Wild was based on things that could carry weapons, because of that sort of scavenger system. And I don't want that system to go away. I'm a pretty big fan of the gathering weapons and materials system in Breath of the Wild, and I'm totally cool with the weapons breaking and all of that. I just think that they could have had more enemies that didn't have that stuff. I think that all you need to do is make the weapons last a little bit longer, and then add enemies that don't drop weapons. So, like, you collect the weapons from the enemies that have the weapons, and then you use those weapons on enemies that don't. And you can get into situations where, like, hey, I've got this sword and it's about to break and there's some redeads here, that's gonna feel kind of scary because you gotta decide how you want to use what you have to get through this. That sentence doesn't really work, but hey, that's the problem of not having a script. You know what I mean, though, I think, hopefully. I want more enemy variety. There's so many classic Zelda enemies that did not make it into Breath of the Wild that I think they can pull, especially if we're doing more, like, underground cave areas, just any kind of different environments is going to naturally lead itself to, more than just lizards and moblins in every area. Okay, so the next point, I think this is going to be the one that most people disagree with me on, but it kind of is going to just be how I would prefer we approach non-linearity if we're keeping non-linearity. And this is going to tie back into what I said with the dungeons, where I feel like the first two were great and the last two sucked no matter what order you did them in. A big part of that for me is that when you have a game that is completely non-linear, you don't really have an escalation of concepts or an escalation of difficulty. It kind of all has to be things that you can do from the very beginning of the game and things that are reasonable for someone to do as their first go at it. I think, honestly, the only area in Breath of the Wild that is kind of a little bit ramped up in difficulty is the Gerudo Desert, and I think that's probably why it ended up being my favorite. But at the same time, I do understand that non-linearity was kind of one of the big selling points of Breath of the Wild, and I feel like for a direct sequel, at least, they're probably not going to want to get rid of that. It's kind of like one of the big things now, especially for an open world game, if this is going to be an open world game. So the approach I would rather them take is to have 2 to 3 clusters of non-linear content as opposed to being fully non-linear. So what I mean by that is, like, let's say there are 5 major areas to the game. I would personally like them to split that up as you have access to 3 areas and you can do those 3 in any order. But once you do all 3 of those, the final 2 areas open up, and you can do those 2 areas in any order, and then there's, like, the final dungeon or whatever. And, like, if you do it that way, you could still have it to where you can go right to the final dungeon if you want, but if you do want to go through the story and see all of the content, there is at least that kind of Group A, and then you do that, and then you unlock Group B, and then you can do that. That's just how I would prefer it to be done. I'm cool with them doing it another way. I just feel like there is a better way to handle the idea of non-linearity than everything is at a very flat and static level of difficulty and level of concepts, where, like, once you get all of your tools in the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild, that's kind of what everything is built on. And now, of course, with the physics engine the Breath of the Wild has, it really is... The fun of that game remains finding ways that you can get around their intended solutions. So, that stuff is great, and that really does keep the second half of the game fresh. And that's, one of the things I love Breath of the Wild for. But I'm not sure how much that is going to be able to hold up multiple games. I feel like if we keep getting games in this style, that will eventually need to be handled differently. And that's just one general idea of how they could handle it differently. And the final point, and definitely one that I think most people will agree with me on, is an actual story. I am probably one of the biggest advocates for Zelda as a series for story and lore that I know of all of my friends. But I do know that the larger Zelda fan base kind of agrees with me in that respect, where that's kind of like, the stories are never the deepest or the most original, but they are there, and they do have a certain charm to them, and that is kind of one of the biggest areas that Breath of the Wild is lacking in, especially considering that that one trailer that showed all those story bits really kind of made Breath of the Wild seem like it was going to have a really cool story, and then it turned out they were all just disconnected flashbacks. That's kind of a bummer, and I think that, they can't do that a second time, so hopefully, and again, maybe this will help if the game isn't as non-linear, it would help just kind of tell an actual story. So that'd be cool. Yeah, so those are just some thoughts about what I want to see from the Breath of the Wild sequel. That first one, the getting weird and doing cool, unique stuff with the framework of Breath of the Wild is kind of the main thing. I just figured I would tack on the other stuff that are things that I felt about Breath of the Wild since it came out that I thought could be improved on in the sequel. I think I might do another video kind of similar to this for Final Fantasy VII Remake tomorrow. If I do that, it might be a little bit more structured. I might write a little bit more of a script because I'm not sure this one came out very well. But I think I'm gonna probably throw it up anyway, just because I am so excited for this game. I love Zelda. A couple months ago I made that big 45-minute Zelda video, and I feel like, I wasn't very happy with the way it came out, and no one watches any of my videos anyway, but I feel like that one in particular was kind of... I probably could have cut that in half and maybe had a more straightforward point. I feel like I meandered a little bit, and I just kind of wanted to gush about Hyrule as a setting, and I don't know if that really made for something worth watching. But I do think I want to do more things with Zelda. I'm not sure what at this point, honestly. But I do really... There are a few series that kind of, I think, are my core series, and they're Final Fantasy, Shin Megami Tensei, Silent Hill, and Zelda. The Legend of Zelda is one of those core pillars for me. And it's just something that I've thought about my whole life, which that sounds kind of sad, but I mean it in a good way. We're just I've always had Zelda, and I like to talk about it. I really like to talk about Zelda. I was on a 100+ episode Let's Play of Breath of the Wild, so clearly there's a lot I could talk about. So I might try to formulate some more things I can think about with Zelda. I might do something with Link's Awakening. If you have any ideas, you can feel free to comment and tell me what you think. And also, if you have any opinions on whether this sort of free form, almost like vlog style, has any worth in trying to refine, or if I should just go back to reading awkwardly worded scripts. Yeah, that's all good. So yeah, that's it for this. Look forward to a Final Fantasy VII Remake video probably tomorrow, and then we'll see from there.